Recorded Books presents Devil Take the Hindmost, A History of Financial Speculation, by Edward Chancellor, narrated by Nigel Patterson. Preface. Devil Take the Hindmost. When I was young, people called me a gambler. As the scale of my operations increased, I became known as a speculator. Now I am called a banker. But I have been doing the same thing all the time. Sir Ernest Cassell, banker to Edward VII. Never before has the subject of speculation attracted as much attention as it does today. Behind much of the contemporary financial and economic news, foreign currency crises, stock market bubbles and crashes, derivatives fiascos, and technological innovations, lurks the speculator. In the United States, millions of individual investors trade stocks daily. The success of the American economy in the 1990s has largely been the product of speculative funds flowing into the stock market. This has enabled new companies to be floated and old ones to be merged, and encouraged corporations to invest and investors to spend some of their stock market gains. A great bubble of prosperity has been blown before our eyes, and its stability is naturally a cause for anxious concern. Speculation is a divisive topic. Many politicians, several of them in Asia, warn that the global economy is being held hostage by speculators. In their opinion, the speculator is a parasitical figure, driven by greed and fear, who creates and thrives on financial crises, an egoist and a slave to his passions, who in his euphoric and depressive moods reflects the limited intellectual outlook of the crowd. To them, the wealth of nations depends on caging this wild beast. Others, mainly Western economists, take a radically different line. They argue that speculation is fundamentally a benign force, essential to the proper functioning of the capitalist system. According to this view, the speculator acts as a conduit, enabling new information, whether it be the results of the latest inflation figures or the effects of a hurricane on coffee production, to be fed through into prices. Without the speculator, markets would be full of bottlenecks, and economic crises would be even more common. Furthermore, the inception of new technologies, such as the Internet, is heavily dependent on the activity of stock market speculators. Curb the speculator, argue the economists, and capitalism will lose its vitality. What's in a name? Despite the endless discussion that it generates, speculation remains an elusive concept. It acquired an economic meaning only in the late 18th century, and even then it was a curiously imprecise term. In a letter dated the 1st of May 1774, Horace Walpole described Sir George Colebrook, the MP and banker, as a martyr to what is called speculation, after Colebrook was bankrupted in a failed attempt to corner the market for alum, a substance used in the dyeing of textiles. 2 years later, Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, referred to the sudden fortunes that are sometimes made by what is called the trade of speculation. Yet Smith's speculative merchant was not a financial operator, but an entrepreneur who exercises no one regular, established, or well-known branch of business. He is a corn merchant this year, or a tea merchant the year after. He enters into every trade when he foresees that it is likely to be more than commonly profitable, and he quits when he foresees that its profits are likely to return to the level of other trades. For Smith, the speculator is defined by his readiness to pursue short-term opportunities for profit. His investments are fluid, whereas those of the conventional businessman are more or less fixed. This distinction was retained by John Maynard Keynes, who described enterprise as the activity of forecasting the prospective yield of assets over their whole life, in contrast to speculation, which he called the activity of forecasting the psychology of the market. Speculation is conventionally defined as an attempt to profit from changes in market price. Thus, foregoing current income for a prospective capital gain is deemed speculative. Speculation is active, while investment is generally passive. According to the Austrian economist J.A. Schumpeter, the difference between a speculator and an investor can be defined by the presence or absence of the intention to trade, that is, realize profits from fluctuations in security prices. The line separating speculation from investment is so thin that it has been said both that speculation is the name given to a failed investment and that investment is the name given to a successful speculation. Fred Schwed, a Wall Street wit, declared that clarifying the difference between investment and speculation was like explaining to the troubled adolescent that love and passion are two different things. He perceives that they are different, but they don't quite seem different enough to clear up his problem. Schwed concluded the two could be separated on the grounds that the first aim of investment was the preservation of capital, while the primary aim of speculation was the enhancement of fortune. As he put it, speculation is an effort, probably unsuccessful, to turn a little money into a lot. Investment is an effort, which should be successful, to prevent a lot of money becoming a little. Similar problems of definition are encountered in distinguishing speculation from gambling. While a bad investment may be a speculation, a poorly executed speculation is often described as a gamble. The American financier Bernard Baruch was once dismissed from the presence of Pierpont Morgan for uttering the word gamble in relation to a business proposition. Later, Baruch recalled that there is no investment which doesn't involve some risk and is not something of a gamble. The psychologies of speculation and gambling are almost indistinguishable. Both are dangerously addictive habits which involve an appeal to fortune, are often accompanied by delusional behavior, and are dependent for success on the control of emotions. Speculation has come to mean different things to different people, yet it retains something of its original philosophical meaning, namely to reflect or theorize without a firm factual basis. According to a 17th-century definition, a speculator is one who indulges in occult observations or studies. The financial speculator still resembles the alchemist in that he is constantly constructing abstruse theories to turn paper into gold, normally with little success. Occasionally, investors consult astrological tables or spiritual mediums in order to enhance their performance. Even today in New York there exists an astrologers' fund whose manager promises naturally stellar returns. People resort to such measures when they are faced with uncertainty. The name given to financial uncertainty is risk. Economists differentiate gambling and speculation on the grounds that gambling involves the deliberate creation of new risks for the sake of diversion, while speculation involves the assumption of the inevitable risks of the capitalist process. In other words, when a gambler places a bet on a horse, he is creating a risk, while the speculator who buys a share is simply involved in the transfer of an existing risk. Speculation is generally considered riskier than investment. The securities analyst Benjamin Graham declared that investment requires a margin of safety, so that the value of the principal is maintained even in unforeseen adverse conditions. An uninformed or spontaneous investment is more speculative than one in which the investor has taken the time to investigate and assess its potential returns. Graham added that buying shares with borrowed money was always speculative. The capitalist is confronted with a broad spectrum of risk, with prudent investment at one end and reckless gambling at the other. Speculation lies somewhere between the two. According to modern economic theory, which holds that markets are efficient, that is, that share prices reflect intrinsic values, and that speculators are simply rational economic agents intent on optimizing their wealth, the history of speculation is a dull affair. In the world of efficient markets, there are no animal spirits, no crowd instincts, no emotions of greed or fear, no trend-following speculators, and no irrational speculative bubbles. Yet the activities of speculators down the ages appear to me to be richer, more diverse in motivation and extraordinary in result than anything described by economists. My own approach is closer to that of Charles Mackay, Dickens' friend, and the author of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, 1841, who provided the first popular accounts of the tulip mania, Mississippi, and South Sea bubbles. For Mackay, speculative manias were a manifestation of the occasional tendency of society to succumb to delusion and mass madness. Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. Mackay's historical narrative of speculative manias remains the only one readily available. While I felt it was time to examine the subject anew, I have not attempted to produce a comprehensive history of speculation. Such a task was likely to yield an unwieldy and repetitious tome whose final page would never be written. Instead, I concentrate on occurrences of speculation in the leading economic powers of the day, from the Dutch Republic in the 17th century to Japan in the 1980s, interspersed with the occasional look at speculation in the present day. I believe that speculation can only be understood within a social context, and that a history of speculation cannot simply be a description of economic affairs, but must also be something of a social history. The behaviour and attitude of politicians towards speculation is especially important, since the laws governing markets are framed and enforced by governments. On numerous occasions we find politicians stimulating speculative manias for their own gain. Above all, I hope to have retained some of Mackay's enthusiasm, so that the listener will come to agree with his observation that the subject of speculation is capable of inspiring as much interest as even a novelist can desire. Is it a dull or uninstructive picture to see a whole people shaking off the trammels of reason and running wild after a golden vision, refusing obstinately to believe that it is not real, till, like an ignis fatuus, they are plunged into a quagmire? Devil take the hindmost. Chapter 1. This Bubble World. The Origins of Financial Speculation. And when dreams deceive our wandering eyes in the heavy slumber of night, and under the spade the earth yields gold to the light of day, our greedy hands finger the spoil and snatch at the treasure. Sweat, too, runs down our face, and a deep fear grips our heart that maybe someone will shake out our laden bosom where he knows the gold is hid. Soon, when these pleasures flee from the brain they mocked, and the true shape of things comes back, our mind is eager for what is lost, and moves with all its force among the shadows of the past. Satyricon of Petronius Arbiter, circa AD 50. The propensity to barter and exchange is an innate human characteristic. An inclination to divine the future is another deeply ingrained trait. Together they comprise the act of financial speculation. All life is speculation, declared the celebrated 19th-century American trader James R. Keene. The spirit of speculation is born with men. For the earliest known historical cases of speculation, we must turn to ancient Rome during the Republic of the 2nd century BC. By this date, the Roman financial system had developed many of the characteristics of modern capitalism. Markets flourished because Roman law allowed the free transfer of property. Money was lent out at interest, money changers dealt in foreign currencies, and payments across the Roman territories could be made by banker's draft. Capital concentrated in Rome, as it later did in Amsterdam, London, and New York. The idea of credit had also developed, along with a primitive form of insurance for ships and other forms of property. The people of Rome exhibited a passion for the accumulation of wealth, matched by an extravagance in its display and consumption. Gaming was common. In Latin, the word speculator describes a sentry whose job it was to look out, speculare, for trouble. The financial speculator in ancient Rome, however, was called quaestor, which means a seeker. Collectively, speculators were sometimes referred to as Graeci, or Greeks. Their meeting place was the Forum, near the Temple of Castor, where crowds of men bought and sold shares and bonds of tax-farming companies, various goods for cash and on credit, farms and estates in Italy and in the provinces, houses and shops in Rome and elsewhere, ships and storehouses, slaves and cattle. The Roman comic playwright Plautus describes the Forum as peopled with whores, shopkeepers, moneylenders, and wealthy men. He identifies specifically two unsavoury groups. The first lot he describes as mere puffers, and the second as impudent, talkative, and malevolent fellows, who boldly, without reason, utter calumnies about one another. In this description we find the originals of the bulls and bears of later stock markets. The Roman state contracted out many of its functions, from tax collecting to temple building, to societies of capitalists, known as publicani. Like modern joint stock companies, the publicani were legal bodies independent of their members, whose ownership was divided into partes, or shares. They had executive managements, produced public accounts, tabulae, and held occasional meetings of shareholders. Many were considerable concerns, employing tens of thousands of slaves. Shares came in two sorts: larger executive shareholdings of the great capitalists, known as socii, and smaller shares called particuli. The manner of dealing in unregistered particuli shares was informal, resembling the modern over-the-counter stock markets. The publicani maintained a system of couriers throughout the Roman territories in order to gather information, enabling them to calculate how much to bid for contracts at auction and how much shares in going concerns were worth. No evidence remains of the prices for which partes sold, and there are no descriptions of stock market behaviour. We do know, however, that shares fluctuated in value. When the Roman consul Vatinius was accused of corruption, he was asked, "Did you extort shares which were at their dearest at the time?" Cicero referred to partes carissimas, most expensive shares, and claimed that buying shares in public companies was seen as a gamble which conservative men avoided. Shares in the publicani did not attract only politicians and large capitalists. Polybius, the Greek chronicler, describes a widespread popular interest in share ownership. All over Italy, he writes, an immense number of contracts, far too numerous to specify, are awarded by the censors for the construction and repair of public buildings, and besides for the collection of revenues from navigable rivers, harbours, gardens, mines, lands. In a word, every transaction which comes under the control of the Roman government is farmed out to contractors. All these activities are carried on by the people, and there is scarcely a soul, one might say, who does not have some interest in these contracts and the profits which are derived from them. Describing the last years of the Republic, Petronius Arbiter wrote that filthy usury and the handling of money had caught the common people in a double whirlpool and destroyed them. The madness spread through their limbs, and trouble bayed and hounded them down like some disease sown in the dumb flesh. Perhaps these are descriptions of the first speculative mania, although the evidence is too weak to prove the case. The Roman publicani withered under the empire, but speculation in property, commodities, and currencies continued. After fiat money, that is, money created by government decree, which has no intrinsic value but depends on public confidence, was introduced in the 3rd century AD, currency crises became common. The city council of Mylassa in Caria, in modern-day Turkey, complained that, as a result of the speculative hoarding of specie, the very security of the city is shaken by the malice and villainy of a few people who assail and rob the community. Through them, speculation in exchange has entered our marketplace, and prevents the city from securing a supply of the necessities of life, so that many of the citizens, and indeed the community as a whole, suffer from scarcity. It is a very modern lament. Financial speculation in the early modern period. The culture of medieval Europe was inimical to financial speculation for both practical and ideological reasons. The feudal system dispensed with many financial transactions of the Roman world, replacing cash dealings with payments in kind. Medieval schoolmen revived the Aristotelian notion of a just price, following the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, who declared that it was unjust and unlawful to sell dearer or buy cheaper than a thing is worth. Usury was also condemned. The pursuit of profit was viewed as both morally corrupting and dangerous to the commonwealth. St. Augustine considered the unlimited lust for gain, appetitus divitarum infinitus, as one of the three principal sins, alongside the craving for power and sexual lasciviousness. In his city of God there was no place for the speculator. When famine threatened, the medieval state intervened to supply food, and speculative hoarding was made illegal. These strictures against profiteering and speculation continue to resonate down the ages. When contemporary politicians rise to condemn the pernicious actions of speculators, they perpetuate unconsciously the scholastic prejudices of medieval monks. In the later Middle Ages, several Italian city-states began issuing marketable government securities. In Venice, government securities were traded from the middle of the 13th century at the Rialto. Speculation seems to have taken its normal course. In 1351, a law was introduced against rumours intended to sink the price of government funds. In 1390, 1404 and 1410, there were repeated attempts to prevent the sale of government obligations on deferred terms, that is, bond futures. The Doge and members of the Ducal Council also tried to outlaw insider trading. State loans also were traded at Florence, Pisa, Verona and Genoa in the 14th century. The Italian city-states farmed out the collection of taxes to monti, companies whose capital was divided into tradable shares, luoghi. These early joint stock companies appear strikingly similar to the Roman publicani. The great fairs of northern Europe, which had their origins in the fora and bacchanalia of ancient Rome, enjoyed exemption from many of the medieval restrictions on trade and finance. They became, in effect, prototype stock markets. At the Leipzig fairs, shares in German mines changed hands in the 15th century. At the Saint-Germain fairs, near Paris, which opened after Lent, municipal bonds, bills of exchange and lottery tickets were traded. Antwerp, with its two lengthy annual fairs in spring and autumn, and year-long permission of free trade, was described as a continuous fair. In the middle of the 16th century, the city gave a home to the first settled bourse, so named after a gathering of merchants at the Hôtel des Bourses in neighbouring Bruges. From the middle of the 16th century, there is more detailed evidence of speculative market conditions. The financial markets had developed a collective notion of credit, the so-called ditta di borsa, and bond prices reflected an anticipation of future events, such as defaults. Market manipulation appeared in the 1530s, when a syndicate organised by the Florentine Gasparducci led an attempt to suppress prices in the Lyons market, what we would now call a bear raid. In the middle of the 1550s, there suddenly appeared in the markets of Antwerp and Lyon a speculative enthusiasm for royal loans, which came to an abrupt end when King Henry II of France suspended payments on his debts in 1557. On an individual level, we find an Antwerp commodity trader, Christoph Kurz, puzzling at the periodic tightness and ease, strettezza and larghezza, of money in the market. He believed that future prices were divinely ordained and discoverable through astrological observation. People bought when prices were at their highest because the upper influences so blind the natural reason with affections or desires. Like a modern technical analyst, Kurz rose early in the morning, surrounded with work as a man in the ocean with water, For our astrologers aforetime have written much, but with little reason. Wherefore I trust not their doctrines, but seek mine own rules. And when I have them, I search in the histories whether it hath fallen out right or wrong. Later, Kurtz forsook the market, and enjoyed great professional success as a political astrologer, forecasting, among other things, the imminent extinction of the papacy. The development of the capital markets in France and Flanders was interrupted in the second half of the 16th century by the wars of religion and the revolt of the Netherlands, and a succession of state bankruptcies. After 1557, Lyon went into decay as a financial centre. The sack of Antwerp by Spanish troops in 1585 led to the permanent decline of its bourse. Amsterdam benefited at the expense of Antwerp, as thousands of Protestant and Jewish refugees fled the Spanish, bringing capital and trading skills to the Netherlands. The stimulus provided by these immigrants has led historians to refer to the Dutch economic miracle of the 1590s. By the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic was the most advanced and thriving economy in Europe. Its merchants encircled the globe, buying wood in Norway, sugar in the West Indies, tobacco in Maryland, investing in forges in Wales or estates in Sweden, farming the Russian Tsar's export monopolies, and supplying Spanish America with slaves. Although the Dutch did not invent the institutions and practices of financial capitalism, such as banking, double-entry bookkeeping, joint stock companies, bills of exchange, and stock markets, they brought together and established them on a secure basis in a mercantile economy organized around a highly evolved profit motive. In 1602, the United East India Company, the first joint stock company to receive an official government charter, was established with a monopoly on Eastern trade. 19 years later, the Dutch West India Company was founded to exploit commercial opportunities in the Americas. Europe's first central bank, the Amsterdam Wisselbank, an institution derived from the Casa San Giorgio in Genoa, was established in 1609. Highly conservative in its operations, the Wisselbank paid no interests on deposits, issued notes only against its gold holdings, and made no loans. Yet its existence allowed Dutch merchants across the globe to settle their accounts bills in a universally accepted currency. The Dutch city authorities raised funds through bond issues and lotteries, which attracted great popular interest. By the early 17th century, capital from across Europe was invested in a variety of Dutch financial assets, from property to annuities, municipal bonds, bills of exchange, and medium-term loans. Amsterdam was not simply a great entrepot, it was the financial capital of the world. All manner of financial products and services were traded on the Amsterdam Exchange. A new exchange was founded in 1610. Commodities, current exchange, shareholdings, maritime insurance. It was a money market, a finance market, and a stock market. Naturally, the exchange became a crucible for speculative activities. Futures contracts, agreements to deliver or take delivery of a commodity at a fixed price some date in the future, were common. Since the previous century, futures had been traded in a variety of commodities, including grain, herring, spices, whale oil, sugar, copper, saltpetre, and Italian silks. In the early 17th century, they became available in the actions shares of the East India Company. Speculators could also take out loans on shares at up to 4/5 of their market value, what Americans later called margin loans. Stock options, which gave the buyer the right, but unlike the futures contract not the obligation, to buy or sell shares at a fixed price during the contract period, were also traded on the exchange. Later in the century, Ducaton shares in the East India Company were introduced. Valued at 1/10 of the highly priced ordinary shares, they enabled less wealthy speculators to play the market. Futures, options, and Ducaton shares are all examples of what we call derivatives, namely financial contracts which derive their value from an underlying asset, such as a share. Together with stock loans, they created the opportunity for financial leverage, so that small rises in share prices brought larger percentage gains to speculators, with small price declines producing the opposite effect. Vega's Confusion. The first description of stock market activity in Western Europe is provided by Joseph Penso de la Vega in his Confusión de Confusiones, written in Spanish. Vega was a Marrano Jew, and published in Amsterdam in 1688. In a series of dialogues between a merchant and a shareholder, he describes the stock market as a madhouse, full of strange superstitions, peculiar practices, and compulsive attractions. Confusion provides a definitive picture of the speculative psychology. The game of speculation is an affair of fools, whose participants show a tendency to ritualistic playfulness. A member of the exchange opens his hand and another takes it, and thus sells a number of shares at a fixed price, which is confirmed by a second handshake. With a new handshake, a further item is offered, and then follows a bid. The hands redden from the blows, I believe, from the shame that even the most respected people do business in such an indecent manner as with blows. The handshakes are followed by shouting, the shouting by insults, the insults by impudence and more insults, shouting, pushes, and handshakes, until the business is finished. In the Complete Gamester, first published in London in 1674 and attributed to the poet Charles Cotton, gambling is described as an enchanting witchery gotten between idleness and vice, an itching disease that makes some scratch the head, whilst others, as if bitten by a tarantula, are laughing themselves to death. Or lastly, it is a paralytic distemper, which, seizing the arm, the man cannot choose but shake the elbow. It renders a man incapable of prosecuting any serious action, and makes him always unsatisfied with his own condition. He is either lifted up to the top of mad joy with success, or plunged to the bottom of despair by misfortune. Always in extremes, always in a storm. And as he is transported as he wins, so losing is tossed upon billows of a high-swelling passion, till he hath lost sight of both sense and reason. The same mentality was found on the Amsterdam Bourse. Vega describes the obsessive-compulsive behaviour of a speculator invoking his luck. He wavers as how best to secure a profit, chews his nails, pulls his fingers, closes his eyes, takes 4 paces and 4 times talks to himself, raises his hand to his cheek as if he has a toothache, puts on a thoughtful countenance, sticks out a finger, rubs his brow, and all this accompanied by a mysterious coughing, as though he could force the hand of fortune. Some speculators are said to be of such a nervous condition, and their behaviour so restless and fixated, that even on their deathbed their last worries are the shares. Many exhibit signs of split personality. There are many occasions, Vega observes, in which every speculator seems to have 2 bodies, so that astonished observers see a human being fighting himself. Like later stock markets, the Amsterdam Bourse in the 17th century was dominated by a perpetual conflict between bulls and bears. Vega contrasted the liefhebbers, lifters up, or bulls, who were scared of nothing, with the contramines, underminers, or bears, who were completely ruled by fear, trepidation, and nervousness. The contramines were said to organize themselves into Kabbalah, that is, bear pools, in order to drive prices down. Speculation for a fall was not new to the Amsterdam Exchange of Vega's day. Back in 1609, the Flemish-born servant Isaac Lemaire had organized a bear raid on the exchange to drive down the price of East India stock. Although his manipulation ended in failure, it led to an edict outlawing sales by speculators who did not at the time own their stock but expected to buy it back cheaper, cover their shorts, at a later date. As with most subsequent anti-speculative legislation, the ban was roundly ignored. Vega's stock market was far from being a forum for rational price adjustments. Speculators were, in his words, full of instability, insanity, pride, and foolishness. They will sell without knowing the motive, they will buy without reason. Their behaviour produced undue movements in stock prices. The expectation of an event creates a much deeper impression upon the exchange than the event itself. Only the shrewd observer, who makes it his business to watch these things conscientiously, without blind passion and irritating stubbornness, will hit upon the right thing innumerable times, though not always. Despite all its faults, the market retained a sinister attraction for Vega. He who has once entered the charmed circle of the exchange is in eternal agitation and sits in a prison, the key of which lies in the ocean, and the bars of which are never opened. Vega's speculators exhibit many of the features associated with the full range of manic-depressive behavior. A manic-depressive experiences violent and uncontrollable mood swings. During his manic phase, he is energetic, grandiose, greedy, sexual, distractible, persuasive, exuding charm and exercising an infectious leadership over others, and above all optimistic. As his expectations grow increasingly unrealistic, the manic becomes careless, and this precipitates his downfall. His moods are cyclical, and during a depression he becomes timid, anxious, enervated, shy, indecisive, and lacking in self-confidence. Unable to see the broader picture, he becomes fixated on insignificant details. As the stock market itself is, like Hobbes's Leviathan, composed of the actions of individual speculators, these neurotic traits can be found in the mass psychology of bull and bear markets. During the bull or manic phase, activity is frenetic and expectations become unrealistic. On the other hand, when the mood of the market is depressed, activity, measured by stock market turnover, is lethargic, and universal pessimism replaces unrealistic optimism. According to Benjamin Graham, the author of The Intelligent Investor, Mr. Market lets his enthusiasms or his fears run away with him. Graham's disciple, the investor Warren Buffett, elaborates this description of Mr. Market's instability. At times he feels euphoric and can see only the favourable factors affecting the business. At other times he is depressed and can see nothing but trouble ahead for both the business and the world. The tendency of the market to produce excessive swings can be ignored for investment purposes, as Graham and Buffett advise, or it can form the basis for speculation, as was the successful practice of the 19th-century economist David Ricardo, who made money by observing that people in general exaggerated the importance of events. If, therefore, dealing as he dealt in stocks, there was reason for a small advance, he bought because he was certain the unreasonable advance would enable him to realize. So when stocks were falling, he sold, in the conviction that alarm and panic would produce a decline not warranted by circumstances. Tulipomania. Conditions in the Dutch Republic in the 1630s were propitious for an outburst of speculative euphoria. It was a period of rising commercial optimism, owing partly to the final extinction of the Spanish military threat and partly to the booming Dutch textile trade, which profited from the turmoil in Central Europe at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. The Amsterdam Bourse had moved into a new building in 1631. The East India Company was profitably developing its settlement in Batavia, and its shares rose faster than at any time during the century. House prices were also climbing sharply, producing a boom in the construction of suburban mansions. The Dutch Republic lost some of its Calvinist austerity, as its people, who enjoyed the highest incomes in Europe, became a nation of consumers. In the tulip they found an object which enabled them to mix their love of display with the avid pursuit of wealth. The intense feeling of the Dutch for flowers can partly be explained by the geography of the Netherlands, whose flat terrain and rich soil provided the perfect ground for the cultivation of bulbs, while a shortage of space allowed for only modest gardens, arranged in tiny parterres, at the centre of which were planted prize flowers, whose bright colours set off the drabness of the surrounding countryside. Most prized of all flowers was the tulip. In the middle of the 16th century, the imperial ambassador to Suleiman the Magnificent, Ogier Ghislain de Busbecq, introduced the first tulip bulbs into Europe from Turkey. Its name came from the Turkish tulipan, meaning a turban. During its early years in Western Europe, the tulip was confined to the gardens of the nobility and specialist botanists. A few years after Busbecq's return, tulips were observed in the Augsburg garden of the Fuggers, an exotic horticultural novelty for Europe's wealthiest banking dynasty. In 1573, the ambassador presented some tulip bulbs to the famous Dutch botanist Carolus Clusius, who distributed them and described the flower in his Rariorum Plantarum Historia. Clusius, who is said to have charged an enormous price for the sale of his tulip bulbs, became the first victim of the growing passion for this rare plant, when one night his bulbs were dug up and stolen. The collectors classified the tulip varieties according to the colouring of their flowers, and gave them splendid militaristic titles to reflect their position in the horticultural hierarchy. At the head of the bulbous troop came the Semper Augustus, with its petals streaked in imperial purple. It was followed by viceroys, admirals, and generals. From the time of their earliest appearance, tulips had been associated with wealth, and in the first quarter of the 17th century the more exotic varieties began to attract extravagant prices. In 1624, a Semper Augustus fetched the handsome sum of 1,200 florins, an amount sufficient to purchase a small Amsterdam townhouse. 10 years earlier, an emblem book by Rumer Visser was published, which contained an engraving of 2 tulips bearing the prescient motto, "A fool and his money are soon parted." The tulip lent itself to speculation. Uncertainty surrounding its variegations, which, unknown to contemporaries, were caused by a virus that attacked the bulb, opened up a game of chance. A plain breeder tulip might break out into a precious Semper Augustus. The bulbs were relatively easy to cultivate, required little land, and there were no guilds restricting entry into the trade. Those who could not afford to purchase the expensive shares of the great joint stock companies could instead wager on a bulb. In the past, the market in tulips had taken place during the summer period, when the bulbs were out of the ground. As popular interest in tulips grew, arrangements were made for them to be traded throughout the year. The growers marked the rows of bulbs. Each bulb was given a number, recording its variety and weight at planting, and the individual bulb's trading history was stored on a separate sheet. Precious varieties were sold by the piece, weighed by the as or ace, 1/20th of a gram, while commoner types were sold by the flower bed. The tulip had become as standardized and undifferentiated as a note of the Wisselbank or a share in the East India Company. The beginning of the Tulpenwoede, or what the Victorians called the tulipomania, is associated with the arrival in the tulip market around 1634 of outsiders who were apparently attracted by stories of rising prices for tulip bulbs in Paris and northern France. Among these entrants to the market, later dismissed by Dutch florists as the new amateurs, were weavers, spinners, cobblers, bakers, grocers, and peasants. Although the tulip craze grew to embrace most social classes, 2 parties were absent who might otherwise have brought stability to the trade. The wealthy amateur bulb collectors, who had long shown a readiness to pay vast sums for the rarer varieties, withdrew their custom as prices began to soar, while the great Amsterdam merchants continued investing their trading profits in townhouses, East India stock, or bills of exchange. For them, tulips remained merely an expression of wealth, not a means to that end. The nature of the tulip market changed as the traffic increased. Private negotiations between individuals gave way to informal meetings in the rooms of inns, called colleges, where traders and speculators could trade in convivial surroundings. A contemporary pamphlet containing 3 dialogues between a speculator Harhut, greedy goods, and his friend Warmont, Truemouth, introduces the business to the neophyte tulip speculator. "You must go to an inn," says Harhut. "I will name a few. I know of few or none where there are no companies or colleges. Being there, you must ask whether there are any florists. If you then come into their room, and because you are a newcomer, some will squeak like a duck, some will say, "A new whore in the brothel," and so on. But don't take any notice. That goes with it. Your name will be put down on a slate. Now the plates go round. That is, everyone who is present at this company has to give plates, beginning with the one at the top of the slate. He who holds the plate must ask for some goods. You may not put up on auction your own goods, but if you drop a hint in conversation and somebody is interested, you are almost sure to have it bid for or to get the plates on it. There were two methods of dealing: direct negotiation between two persons or general auction. The former method, called with the plates, described just now, involved both buyer and seller inscribing an agreed price for a bulb on wooden plates provided by the college. Auctions were referred to as in the naught, since the seller set a starting price by writing a figure in the middle of a slate circled with a 0. A commission of up to 3 guilders for wine money was paid by the buyer to the college, which was spent on tobacco, alcohol, light, and heating. Pleasure was mixed with profit. I have been on several journeys, related Harhut, when I brought home more money than I brought to the inn. And then I had eaten and drunk wine, beer, tobacco, cooked or roast fish, meat, even fowls and rabbits, and sweets to finish, and that from the morning till 3 or 4 at night, and I made a beautiful profit too. Speculators who took their profits, or were confident of receiving their dues, spent their gains on new coaches and horses. All grandeurs were imagined. No one knew how high he would rise in his estate. No actual delivery of tulips took place during the height of the boom in late 1636 and early 1637, as the bulbs remained snug in the ground. A market in tulip futures appeared, known as the Windhandel, the wind trade. Sellers promised to deliver a bulb of a certain type and weight the following spring. Buyers took the right to delivery. In the meantime, cash settlement could be made for any difference in market price. Most transactions were expedited with personal credit notes, which also fell due in the spring when the bulbs would be dug up and delivered. Harhut boasts of having made 60,000 guilders from his tulip speculations, but admits that he has only received other people's writing. By the later stages of the mania, the fusion of the Windhandel with paper credit created a perfect symmetry of insubstantiality. Most transactions were for tulip bulbs that could never be delivered because they didn't exist, and were paid for with credit notes that could never be honoured because the money wasn't there. The average annual wage in Holland was between 200 and 400 guilders. A small townhouse cost around 300 guilders, and the best flower paintings sold for no more than 1,000 guilders. Against these values we can measure the extravagance of tulip prices. According to the dialogues, a Gouda bulb of 4 aces rose from 20 to 225 guilders. A Generalissimo of 10 aces, which had sold for 95 guilders, fetched 900 guilders. A pound of plain yellow kronen, which sold for around 20 guilders, rose in a few weeks to over 1,200. That is, the price went from the equivalent of 1 month's pay to 5 years. Yes, Harhut admits, it has gone so far that the stuff which used to be weeded and thrown in basketfuls on the dung heap has been sold for heavy money. The Semper Augustus retained its position as the most prized bulb. Harhut relates how, about 3 years ago, it was sold for 2,000 guilders, transferred at once at the bank, but at the height of the boom it might sell for even 6,000, and possibly more, even if it be a plant of only 200 aces. A viceroy that formerly sold for 3,000 guilders doubled in price. A contemporary pamphleteer calculated that the 2,500 guilders paid for a single bulb would have bought 27 tons of wheat, 50 tons of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 3 tons of cheese, a bed with linen, a wardrobe of clothes, and a silver beaker. There was little attempt to justify these prices. Most speculators entered into contracts with the intention of selling quickly at a higher price. When Hight advises Vermont to speculate, he tells him that you give no money till it's summer, and then you have sold all your staff. Asked how long the madness will last, Hight replies, "If it only goes on for 2 or 3 years, it is sufficient for me." An anonymous pamphleteer, however, expressed reservations. If there should ever be more sellers than buyers, which given the number of people involved could easily occur, then the collapse of this mania will be at hand. On the 3rd of February 1637, the tulip market suddenly crashed. There was no clear reason for the panic, except that spring was approaching when delivery fell due, and the game would be up. In Haarlem, the centre of the flower trade, rumours circulated that there were no more buyers, and the next day tulips were unsaleable at any price. Contracts were not settled, and one default followed another. The professional florists attempted in vain to extract payment from defaulting speculators. However, the collapse of the tulip mania did not cause a national economic crisis. N. W. Posthumus, the historian of the tulip mania, refers to a more modest upheaval in the whole western part of the Republic. The great merchants, upon whose credit the economy depended, were largely unaffected. But many of the lower orders were not so fortunate. Those who had mortgaged their properties and exchanged their chattels for a chance of quick gain must have suffered a permanent loss of wealth. A few individual instances of ruin are recorded, including that of the landscape painter Jan van Hoyen, who on the eve of the crash had exchanged 900 guilders and 2 paintings for a quantity of bulbs. He died insolvent 19 years later. Litigation in the tulip market continued until, finally, in May 1638, a government commission declared that tulip contracts could be annulled on payment of 3.5% of the agreed price. By this date, amateur bulb collectors had returned to market to pick up rare bulbs at bargain prices, and within a few years the prices of precious tulips, including the Semper Augustus, regained the levels they had traded at prior to the mania. However, the prices for the plain breeder bulbs, known as the Gemene Goed, common goods, and Voderai, rags, which had attracted the smaller speculators during the boom, never recovered. Blowing bubbles, the allegories and legends of speculation. In the aftermath of the crisis, tulipomania gave way to tulipophobia, a revulsion analogous to the public distaste for common stocks after the great crash of 1929. The professor of botany at Leiden, Evrard Forstius, was said to be so incensed by the flower that he could not see a tulip without attacking it viciously with his stick. By offering reward without effort, the speculative mania had violated the Calvinist work ethic. As Vermont asked in the Dialogues, "What need is there for merchants to have any style, or to risk their goods overseas, for the children to learn a trade, for peasants to sow and to work so hard on the soil, for the skipper to sail on the terrible and dangerous seas, for the soldier to risk his life for so little gain, if one can make profits of this sort?" Furthermore, by raising some to riches and reducing others to penury, speculation had unsettled relations between the various social classes. According to Hight, each speculator was a bigger master than the other. Just as the tulip was well adapted to serve as an object of financial speculation, it now came to represent luxury, wickedness, and superfluity alongside the traditional images of skulls, hourglasses, and books in the allegorical depictions of Dutch vanitas painters. The tulip became the symbol of folly in the sense anticipated by Visser's emblem, its ephemeral beauty seen as a seductive illusion to the unwary. Another common vanitas symbol was the bubble, which represented the evanescence of human life. Homo bulla est, man is a bubble, the Roman moralist Varro had declared. A bubble grew rapidly, delighting beholders with its reflective brilliance, but disappeared instantaneously. It was sustained only by air or wind, a symbolism recognized both in the 17th-century Dutch expression windhandel to describe the futures trade, and in a contemporary tulpenwoorde print depicting the allegorical figure of Flora blown in a wind chariot, and later in the stockbroker's nefarious practice of puffing up a share. The bubble metaphor, however, was not applied to speculative excesses until the time of the South Sea bubble in 1720. In the meantime, the tulip served an identical function. It burst forth in glorious colours, just as suddenly its petals blew off and the plant withered, only to return with the next cycle of nature. A number of legends developed around the tulip mania. The most famous of them provided the inspiration for Alexandre Dumas' novel The Black Tulip. A syndicate of Haarlem florists, hearing that a cobbler at the Hague had succeeded in growing a black tulip, visited him and after some haggling purchased the bulb for 1,500 florins. No sooner was it in their possession than they threw it on the ground and trampled it underfoot. "Idiot!" cried one of them, when the astonished cobbler began to protest. "We have a black tulip too, and chance will never favour you again. We would have given you 10,000 florins if you had asked for it." The wretched cobbler, inconsolable at the thought of the wealth which might have been his, took to his bed and promptly expired. This legend, it is impossible to cultivate a black tulip, the closest achievable colour being dark brown, reflects the corruption and cupidity that the tulip mania provoked. The black tulip and a number of other legends from later periods have entered the popular history of speculation. Out of the Mississippi bubble came stories of lackeys who rose to fortune so rapidly that when they picked up their new coaches they forgot themselves and mounted to their old accustomed postilion positions. Another tale from the same period relates how a doctor, while taking the pulse of an elderly female patient, murmurs to himself, "Oh, good God, it falls, it falls," nearly scaring the lady to death, who is only saved when she discovers that he is referring to the Mississippi stock rather than her heartbeat. From the South Sea bubble and the great crash of 1929 came exaggerated tales of speculators' suicides. These tales constitute the folklore of the financial markets, which, feeding on rumour, are particularly fertile grounds for their cultivation. Like the medieval exemplar, the legends contain parables of the 7 deadly sins: pride, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, avarice, and sloth, along with the folly that springs from human credulity. They reflect a popular distrust of the morally corrosive effects of speculation. Financial manias were seen as upsetting the social order, lackeys buying coaches, enfeebling the work ethic, hence the tale of the doctor's dereliction, and bringing ruin to the people. The bubble legends continue to serve an admonitory purpose, warning of the snare of speculation. The British journalist Christopher Fildes recently reminded readers of The Spectator, the 19th of July 1996, that people who purchased houses at the top of the market in the late 1980s have learned the hard way what a dangerous illusion a housing boom can be, and it seems rather soon to forget. Indeed, in any market, fallen favourites never quite come back. Even today, in Holland, there is no great demand for black tulips. For speculators down the ages, the message of the legends remains clear. Remember the black tulip. Remember the bodies lying beneath the skyscrapers, and beware. An affair of fools? The presence of the tulip legends in a number of popular historical and financial books, including Thomas Babington Macaulay's History of England, Walter Bagehot's Lombard Street, and Charles Mackay's best-selling account of speculative manias, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, 1841, has led some to question whether a mania for tulips ever really existed. Peter Garber, an American economist, has claimed that the falsity of the tulip legends undermines the credibility of the mania. He also argues that contemporary source material for the episode, including the dialogues of Warmont and Harhout, should be seen as government propaganda and treated with scepticism. Instead of a mania, he claims, the tulip speculation was rational. In this view, the high prices for the more exotic flowers could be justified on the grounds that the mother bulb's offshoots would compensate for any subsequent decline in price. He also finds that the price changes for tulips conformed to a common pattern found for other precious flower bulbs. The first bulbs of a fashionable new variety sell for a premium price, but the price declines rapidly as the flower becomes more common or as new varieties are introduced in competition. In 18th century Holland, hyacinths also enjoyed a brief period of popularity when their prices soared. According to this thesis, the so-called mania for tulips reflected no more than a blip in demand for a modish commodity, whose price was anyhow volatile. This bold attempt at historical revisionism does not withstand scrutiny. Garber's aim is to lend support to the efficient market school of economic thought, which suggests that bubbles or manias cannot exist since market prices, whether of stocks or tulips, always reflect their intrinsic value. Yet the dialogues give the impression of being a balanced and analytical account of the tulip market in the 1630s. Their method of narration, a discourse between two fictional characters, was a conventional device for recording events. Although they carry a moralizing anti-speculative message, they do not contain any of the tulip legends which are related with such relish by Charles Mackay and others. Even if one were to accept that the dialogues were issued for propaganda purposes, this presupposes a need for propaganda, namely a post-speculative crisis. Nor can the high prices for tulip bulbs have reflected the rational expectations of investors, since it was not known until the 20th century that the variegated tulip petals were the result of a virus which attacked the bulb. The bulbous offshoots of a Semper Augustus would neither flower nor produce further offshoots for several years, and there was no guarantee that they would exhibit the special qualities of the mother bulb, since they were just as likely to revert to the plain breeder variety. Tulips did not even produce an annual cash yield or dividend, because there was no trade in cut flowers at the time. Furthermore, the pattern of sharp price rises and declines that Garber finds for other flower types, such as hyacinths, does not disprove the existence of a tulip bubble. On the contrary, one might argue that the existence of later bubbles suggests that the Dutch flower market, like the stock market, was particularly susceptible to outbursts of speculative euphoria. Even Garber concedes that the prices of the common breeder bulbs, which increased 20-fold during the last phase of the boom, rose to unexplainable heights. He ascribes this to an outbreak of bubonic plague at the time, which created an apocalyptic mentality and stimulated a brief spasm of speculation not justified by market fundamentals. We would go further and state that the purchase of any tulip bulb, whether variegated or plain, in the winter of 1636, could only be justified by the hope, not a rational expectation, that the bulb could be sold quickly at a higher price to some greater fool. In short, the term speculative mania aptly describes conditions of the Dutch tulip market in the mid-1630s. The trade in tulips was for many participants an alternative to speculation in company shares. In several ways, the tulip and stock markets resembled each other. The great variety of tulip bulbs calls to mind the multitude of shares found in later stock markets, with the highly priced variegated bulbs playing the role of blue chips, like the so-called Nifty 50 stocks of the early 1970s, and the common breeder bulbs resembling the penny stocks, which attract speculators of limited means. The windhandel in tulips was identical to the futures business at the Amsterdam Exchange, although Mackay's claims that tulips were traded on the exchange is not accurate, and the style of trading at the tulip colleges anticipated the share auctions in the New York stock market in the early 19th century. The course of the tulip mania was similar to that of many later stock market manias. Just as the tulip mania was initially stimulated by a price rise for precious bulbs which attracted new entrants into the market, So stock market booms are commonly triggered by a sharp climb in the share prices of a particular sector, whether railway stocks in the 1840s or motor cars in the 1920s, which entices outsiders to speculate. It is another common feature of bull markets that as a mania progresses, the quality of the stocks that attract speculation declines. A rising tide floats all ships, even the most unseaworthy. The Tulpenwerde was no different. Speculation in the Semper Augustus bulbs gave way to a manic trade in breeder bulbs. Several other features of tulip mania are common to later stock market booms. Rumours fueling the boom, the rapid growth of leverage through the use of futures and paper credit, conspicuous consumption among speculators, sharply rising prices followed by sudden panic without cause, and initial government passivity followed by belated intervention. The Austrian economist J. A. Schumpeter observed that speculative manias commonly occur at the inception of a new industry or technology, when people overestimate the potential gains and too much capital is attracted to new ventures. Perhaps the speculators of the 1630s, entranced by the novelty of the tulip, were anticipating the development of the Dutch flower industry, now the largest in the world. If so, as with many later speculators, their foresight was not to be rewarded financially. As James Buchan observes, the vision of speculators is vitiated by their delusive conception of time. The great stock market bull seeks to condense the future into a few days, to discount the long march of history, and capture the present value of all the future. More often than not, the future turns out to be less tractable than the speculator would wish. Perhaps the closest parallel to the tulip mania is provided by the Kuwaiti Souk al-Munakh bubble of the early 1980s, which similarly demonstrates the effects of an excessive issue of paper credit in a speculative market. In the Kuwaiti stock market, speculation in the shares of local Gulf companies, whose interests ranged from property to poultry farming, was conducted by means of personal credit in the form of post-dated checks, similar to the credit notes of tulip speculators. In the first 8 months of 1982, over 3,500 million shares changed hands, with a market value of $6 billion. Their book value was only $200 million. The outstanding value of deferred checks exceeded $90 billion, despite interest rates climbing to over 300%. Just as settlement for credit notes of the tulip speculators was delayed until spring, so the Kuwaiti checks did not fall due until the end of the year. In the early spring of 1982, share prices commonly doubled by the hour, and no price was considered too high to pay for a share. In August, however, a female speculator asked for her check to be cashed early. The spell was broken, and the market crashed. The government was forced to step in to restore order at a cost of billions of dollars. Contracts made during the boom were annulled, and the market was closed down. The Carnival of Speculation. An engraving entitled Flora's Cap of Fools by the Dutch artist Peter Nolpe, published shortly after the demise of the tulip mania, depicts tulip dealers haggling inside a giant fool's coxcomb. During the American bull market of the 1990s, the most popular online investment forum has been The Motley Fool. Its young founders wear coxcombs in public as they propose their foolery as a path to stock market riches, in place of the wisdom of Wall Street. This reappearance of the fool in the imagery of speculation is not fortuitous. Speculation grew out of the crowds and bustle of the Renaissance fairs and carnivals, and although by the 17th century the carnival was in decline, and fairs had been replaced by permanent stock exchanges, the carnival spirit lingered in the markets. Gambling was prevalent at carnivals and fairs. It was a typical carnival activity, both profane and anti-hierarchic. In the face of fortune, social distinction counts for nothing, and everyone becomes equal. The carnival was accompanied by what the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin called a grotesque realism, which involved the parodic degradation of values as everything spiritual was transferred to a material level. The Liturgy of the Gamblers was often found among the parodical texts. Carnival language was irreverent and obscene. It was the language of Billingsgate, the London fish market, which remains the vernacular of stock markets to this day. The carnival spirit of equality also suffused the exchanges. As Vega writes in Confusión de Confusiones, itself a parodic carnivalistic title, a witty man, observing the business on the exchange, the studied impoliteness there, remarked that the gamble on the exchange was like death, in that it made all people equal. While the spirit of carnivalism endures in the stock market, the speculative mania represents a continuation of the carnival proper. Both carnival and mania produced the world turned upside down. The carnival offered a moment of release from the rigidities and religious demands of the medieval world, when the traditional social hierarchy was inverted and the village idiot became carnival king. Although the modern market economy is far freer than its medieval antecedent, it has created new tensions. While the carnival deliberately undermined the authority of the Church, the speculative mania reverses the nostrums of capitalism, such as devotion to a professional calling, honesty, thrift, and hard grind. Like the carnival, it provides only a temporary release, since when the mania collapses, these values are reinforced. The medieval carnival was a cyclical event, occurring in a special time, divorced from daily realities. The French historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie refers to what he calls the orgasmic interim of the carnival. The time of the speculative mania is also both cyclical and abnormal. Afterwards, speculators recall it as unreal and dreamlike. For Bakhtin, the carnival is linked to moments of crisis, of breaking points in the cycle of nature or in the life of society and man. Moments of death and revival, of change and renewal, always lead to a festive perception of the world. This accords with Schumpeter's observation that speculative manias generally appear during periods of profound economic upheaval. The Dionysiac aspect of the carnival survives in the conspicuous consumption and revelry of speculators. Both carnival and speculative mania end in a similar fashion. Order is restored after the carnival by the symbolic burning of the carnival king in effigy. After the mania, the leading speculators, from John Law of the Mississippi Company in 1720 to Michael Milken, the junk bond king, in 1990, are pilloried, stripped of their wealth, and imprisoned. Like the carnival king, they become scapegoats for the sins of the community, and are sacrificed so that normality can return. The spirit of speculation is anarchic, irreverent, and anti-hierarchic. It loves freedom, detests cant, and abhors restrictions. From the tulip colleges of the 17th century to the internet investment clubs of the late 20th century, speculation has established itself as the most demotic of economic activities. Although profoundly secular, speculation is not simply about greed. The essence of speculation remains a utopian yearning for freedom and equality, which counterbalances the drab rationalistic materialism of the modern economic system with its inevitable inequalities of wealth. Throughout its many manifestations, the speculative mania has always been, and remains to this day, the carnival of capitalism, a feast of fools. Chapter 2. Stock Jobbing in Change Alley, the projecting age of the 1690s. Nowhere does history indulge in repetitions so often or so uniformly as in Wall Street. When you read contemporary accounts of booms or panics, the one thing that strikes you most forcibly is how little either stock speculation or stock speculators today differ from yesterday. The game does not change, and neither does human nature. Edwin Lefebvre, Reminiscences of a Stock Operator, 1923. Take a contemporary investment banker, dress him in a wig, frock coat, breeches, stockings, and a pair of buckle shoes, and send him back in time to Exchange Alley in the 1690s. It is a narrow street in the City of London, winding between Cornhill and Lombard Street, where meat, fish, fruit and vegetable vendors ply their wares. Their carts block our banker's progress, and the stench of rotten vegetables forces him to seek refuge in one of a number of coffee-houses, situated among the alley's barbers, booksellers and ale-houses. After ordering a cup of tea, he acquaints himself with his new surroundings. He sees walls plastered with posters offering rewards for the return of diamonds, and bills of exchange dropped in the vicinity, and gilt-framed notices advertising golden elixirs, popular pills, beautifying waters, drops and lozenges, all as infallible as the Pope. In one corner of the coffee-house, wine is being sold at auction by an inch of candle. When the candle burns out, the bidding ceases. In another, men are wagering on the outcome of the siege of some Flemish town. Just as the time-traveller is beginning to feel dazed and confused, a well-dressed man enters Jonathan's coffee-house. "How go the stocks?" he inquires of a Jewish gentleman, who, extracting himself from a huddle of drab-looking men in Puritan garb, goes to greet him. "What stocks have you to dispose of? What price for loftings or blue paper? How much an East India put?" The demoralized banker starts to cheer up, for he recognizes at least some of the language of interests, discounts, transfers, tallies, debentures, shares and projects, which fills his ears. He beckons the stock jobber to his side for an explanation. The jobber tells the modern banker a familiar tale of a wave of exciting new technology companies coming to the market, of rising share prices and record stock turnover, or newfangled financial derivatives, of credit wildly extended, of stock market rumours and sharp practices, and of naive investors rushing to buy shares. Finally, the jobber speaks excitedly of the profits which he intends to make from this hullabaloo. The time-traveller smiles knowingly. He is beginning to feel himself quite at home. The past is not a world he has lost. The course and features of the 1690s stock market boom are clearly recognizable to any operator in the contemporary financial markets, even though the London stock market at that date was barely a decade old and remained fairly primitive, consisting of informal meetings of brokers and clients in the coffee-houses of Change Alley and the covered walks of the Royal Exchange. A few years earlier, the word broker had referred simply to a procurer or pimp, and others such as stock jobber, director, subscription, underwriting, puts and refusals, that is, call options, were unknown. All of a sudden, these words comprised a financial argot that spouted from every mouth. There had been no quiet evolution, no period of maturation, no learning process. Like the goddess Athena, the stock market came into existence fully formed. Instead of wailing at its birth, the market boomed. Credit is money. The emergence of the stock market in London was one of a number of innovations in late 17th century England, collectively termed the Financial Revolution, which coincided with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the Dutch stadtholder William of Orange snatched the throne from his Catholic father-in-law James II. They included the parliamentary guarantee for government loans in 1693, which created what was later known as the national debt, the establishment of the Bank of England, with permission to circulate a paper currency in 1694, the introduction of Exchequer Bills 1696, and the Promissory Notes Act of 1704, which made all debts negotiable and hence transferable. These innovations, so heavily influenced by Dutch practice that they were sometimes known as Dutch finance, were introduced to help the state tap the resources of the country for the costly war against Louis XIV's France. Since the time of the Civil War, 1642–51, English goldsmiths had taken on the functions of bankers, making loans and creating a market for merchants' bills of exchange, credit notes. By the 1690s, the total value of bills of exchange in circulation was believed to exceed the currency of the kingdom. Several writers observed that through its circulation, this new form of credit had many properties in common with money. Yet credit, unlike gold, could be created and destroyed. It had no utility, and its value depended on an act of belief, from which it derived its name, Latin, credere creditum, to believe. Credit was in constant flux, elusive, independent, and uncontrollable. Contemporaries likened it to a flighty young maiden. "It is never to be forced," wrote the contemporary economist Charles Davenant. "It hangs upon opinion, it depends upon our passions of hope and fear. It comes many times unsought for, and often goes away without reason, and when once lost, is hardly to be quite recovered." Credit was the Siamese twin of speculation. They were born at the same time and exhibited the same nature. Inextricably linked, they could never be totally separated. The 1690s spawned a breed of unprincipled and self-seeking characters, the so-called moneyed men, who turned the financial innovations of the day to their personal advantage. At their head stood men such as Sir Josiah Child, the banker and East India stockholder, who argued that all men were led by their profit, and James Bridges, Earl, later Duke of Chandos, who made his fortune as Paymaster General of the Army. Less respectable were the dealers around the exchange, such as the stationer Thomas Guy and the merchant John Vulture Hopkins, both of whose meanness was legendary. These men were the living embodiment of a new liberal ideology, in which self-interest replaced noblesse oblige, and the former vices of avarice and consumption were seen as having beneficial economic effects. This development was most evident in the stock market, where jobbers and their clients pursued personal gain to the exclusion of any other consideration. In The True Picture of a Modern Whig, 1701, Charles Davenant satirized the new moneyed man. Tom Double, a denizen of Garraway's, one of the stock-dealing coffee-houses of Exchange Alley, is a model of amoral self-interest. "'Tis the principle of us modern Whigs," he declares, "to get what we can, no matter how." He belongs to a group of men who, having raised themselves from poverty to great wealth, despise the advantages of birth. Double flaunts his good fortune with all the pride of the parvenu. "I have my country house, where I keep my whore as fine as an empress. I have my French cook and wax candles. I drink nothing but Hermitage, champagne, and Burgundy. Cow or wine has hardly admittance to my sideboard. My very footmen scorn French claret." With his carriages, fine wine, and mistress, Double is the yuppie of his age, a master of the universe, in the mould of the bond trader Sherman M'Coy, Tom Wolfe's creation in The Bonfire of the Vanities. There is an affinity between the two periods. Like the 1980s, the 1690s were a decade when it rained gold and silver. Diving and floating in the early stock market. Although joint stock companies, business organisations whose capital was divided into shares, had existed in England since the 16th century, there was no regular market for trading in shares until the 1690s. Formerly, the East India Company shares had been sold at auction along with the company's wares. The necessary conditions for a perfect market, liquidity and the free transferability of shares, did not exist before this date. Foreigners were forbidden from holding shares, and share transfers required the approval of a special committee which had the right to levy fines on outsiders for admission to the company. Ownership of shares in the chartered companies, the East India, Royal African, and Hudson's Bay, was concentrated among a few wealthy persons, and stock turnover was so low that no continuous series of stock prices can be found from an earlier date. Before this period, speculation was confined to the commodities traded at the Royal Exchange, where it did not attract the interest of the public. The nation was rich, trade prodigiously great, paper credit run high, and the goldsmiths in Lombard Street and elsewhere commanded immense sums, was how Daniel Defoe remembered the 1680s. The Glorious Revolution is the only revolution in history to have occurred at a time of great prosperity, a prosperity fostered by a run of good harvests, the profits from foreign trade, and the arrival of Dutch and Huguenot immigrants who brought with them new skills and capital. The chartered joint stock companies shared in the general affluence. Between 1682 and 1692, the East India Company paid out dividends equal to 4 times its nominal capital. A proprietor who had bought into the company in 1660 and sold the stock in 1688 would have received a return on his investment of 1,200% above the prevailing rate of interest. By the end of the decade, the chartered company's shares were trading at a sizable premium to their net asset value. When a regular market for stocks emerged in Exchange Alley, turnover in shares increased dramatically, causing Sir Josiah Child to refer to a kindly, natural, and continual changing motion, insomuch that the value of the whole stock of the East India Company once in 2 years or thereabouts changes owners. According to the 17th century statistician Gregory King, the economic surplus doubled in the quarter of a century to 1688. This provided the capital for a new breed of company promoters, or projectors as they were called, to draw upon. Even before the arrival of William of Orange, a vibrant spirit of enterprise was evident in the establishment of joint stock companies, such as the Convex Lights Company, founded in 1684 to manufacture a new type of street lighting. The rage for establishing new companies, what Defoe called the projecting humour, did not properly get underway until 1687. In that year, William Phipps, a New England sea captain, returned to England with 32 tons of silver and a quantity of jewels raised from a Spanish plate ship sunk off the island of Hispaniola. After the king, Captain Phipps, and his sailors had received their portions, nearly £190,000 was left to distribute to the partners who had backed the expedition, in the form of a 10,000% dividend, enriching them beyond expectation, as John Evelyn recorded in his diary. The success of the expedition created a great stir across the country. Captain Phipps, a former shepherd boy, was knighted within 3 weeks of his return, and a commemorative medal was struck. Others sought to emulate Phipps's success, yet instead of creating partnerships, as had been the case with the Phipps venture, the new treasure-hunting schemes were floated as joint stock companies. The age of adventuring, a tradition going back to the Elizabethan privateers, suddenly gave way to an age of speculation. 2 types of diving company were launched in the wake of Phipps's success. The first kind acquired a patent from the government, which gave it monopoly rights to fish for wrecks at specific locations. Thomas Neal, the master of the Mint and the leading projector of the age, was involved in 3 patented salvage companies for operations off Jamaica, Bermuda, and Portugal. Captain John Poyntz of the Tobago Company applied for a patent for taking up wrecks out of the sea and fishing for pearls and ambergris in the West Indies. The other kind of diving company was established with a technological patent for one of the recently invented diving engines. As engine begat engine and project begat project, over a dozen new diving engine companies appeared. They included the Company for Raising Wrecks in England, secured on a patent for the diving bell of the Astronomer Royal Edmund Halley. The company appeared in the early stock lists as Diving Halley. Daniel Foe, as the author of Robinson Crusoe then styled himself, was employed as the secretary-treasurer to another diving bell company, established by a Cornishman named Joseph Williams. The diving company projectors set out to stimulate public interest in their shares. The wealth which was fetched out of the sea was trumpeted all over the world, public demonstrations of diving engines were given on the Thames, and free shares were given to people of note and figure to give reputation to the affair, and these doughty names were subscribed to play the part of a shoeing horn and wheedle in the easy. Treats and money were given to the necessitous and sharp to bring their friends and acquaintance to see the engine. In its prospectus, the diving company of Captain Poyntz promised a return of 100% to investors. The Hight sent shares to a great premium above their issue price. Defoe reported that he had seen shares in joint stocks, patents, engines, and undertakings blown up by the air of great words, with the shares of one diving company rising by 500%. However, the craze for diving machines and treasure-seeking companies soon died down after their failure to salvage anything more than a few iron guns, chimney backs, and ship's tackle. The share price of the same company that had increased fivefold began to dwindle away till it has been stock-jobbed down to 12 shillings, 10, 9, 8 shillings a share, and at last no buyer. Defoe was writing from unhappy experience, having lost £200 in Williams's diving company. Years later he wrote, "I could give a very diverting history of a patent monger whose cully, that is, dupe, was nobody but myself." War had broken out with France in 1689, as Louis XIV sought to overturn William of Orange's usurpation of the English crown. Rather than causing a commercial crisis, however, the outbreak of war actually stimulated the nascent English stock market. As the French saying goes, achetez au canon, vendez au clairon. Buy at the cannon's roar, sell when the trumpets sound. The interruption of foreign trade obliged merchants to find another outlet for their capital, while Parliament passed an act forbidding French imports. Promoters sponsored a crop of new companies to manufacture goods formerly brought over from France. Typical of these ventures was the Royal Lustering Company, which in 1692 raised £62,000 from the sale of shares in order to manufacture a fashionable French cloth known as à la mode, or lustering, described as a fine, light, glossy black silk. Like the diving companies, these new flotations met with initial success in the stock market. Shares in the White Paper Company, floated in 1690 at 50, increased threefold over the following 4 years. Those in Nicholas Dupin's Linen Company rose from 10 in 1690 to 45 3 years later. In June 1691, Dupin attempted a fashionable diversification, petitioning for the privilege to raise wrecks off the south coast of England so that the linen industry should not sink for want of support during its minority. Individual projectors hedged their bets by maintaining interests in a number of different schemes. Thomas Neal, for instance, was involved in 39 companies, with interests extending from diving patents to water, paper, steel and mining companies. In several projects, Neal was in partnership with John Tyzack, who, besides owning the patent for a diving machine, also received a patent for establishing a company to produce imitation Russia leather. Nicholas Dupin managed 3 white paper companies in England, Scotland and Ireland, as well as a Scottish mining company. Many of these new companies were floated with patents for inventions. Between June 1691 and October 1693, 61 patents were issued altogether, of which 11 were for diving engines. They included the Company for the Sucking Worm Engines of Mr. John Lofting, which held a patent for an engine for quenching fire, the like whereof was never seen before in this kingdom. Another patent company, the Night Engine Company, manufactured a burglar alarm, which it claimed could be set in a convenient place of any house to prevent thieves from breaking in. From their first appearance, the new companies were viewed with widespread scepticism. According to a contemporary author, most of them were mere whims and of little or no service to the world, though they, the projectors, proclaim loudly their worth and goodness, and employ agents to magnify their inventions, and wheedle in innocent and ignorant people, who, being charmed with the novelty of things, though perhaps but revived or borrowed from some foreign nation, purchase shares, and so are cheated of their money, which is worse than highway robbing. In his play The Volunteers, or The Stock Jobbers, 1692, the poet laureate Thomas Shadwell satirized the appearance of patent companies in the stock market. In one scene, a jobber tells of a new company to manufacture a mousetrap that will invite all mice in, any rats too, whether they will or no. A whole share before the patent is £15. After the patent they will not take 60. There is no family in England that will be without 'em. When the wife of a rich speculator expresses interest in a diving company, her husband gently chides her feminine naivety. Look thee, lamb, between us, it's no matter whether it turns to any use or not. The main end verily is to turn the penny in the way of stock jobbing, that's all. Although this was the scientific age of Sir Isaac Newton and the Royal Society, the patent companies of the 1690s were not genuine attempts to apply scientific advances for commercial purposes. Patents were registered without examination of their efficacy, and were used by promoters as a convenient device to launch companies in the stock market, while avoiding the time and expense of incorporation. Gambling in the early capital markets. From 1692 onwards, the apothecary and coffee trader John Houghton provided regular lists of stock market prices in his twice-weekly commercial periodical, A Collection for the Improvement of Husbandry and Trade. As the boom progressed, the number of stocks named by Houghton increased from 10 to 57 in May 1694, with the new companies listed by their market nicknames, Knight, Lofting, Diving W, and so on. In order to facilitate the transfer of shares, standard sale contracts were printed. The sophisticated tools of speculation, including stock options and futures, then known as time bargains, were imported from Amsterdam. Houghton even provided separate prices for East India Company futures, and described how putting, buying an option to sell a stock at a certain price, might be used by shareholders as a hedge or insurance against a drop in price. He also recognized that options could lead to straightforward speculation. By this means many are encouraged to come into new stocks, the success whereof is very uncertain. As stock jobbing became fashionable, Houghton endeavoured to inform his readers of its mysteries. The manner of the trade is this. The moneyed man goes among the brokers, which are chiefly upon the exchange and at Jonathan's coffee house, sometimes at Garraway's, and at some other coffee houses, and asks how stocks go, and upon information bids the broker buy or sell so many shares of such and such stocks, if he can, at such and such prices. Then he tries what he can do among those that have stocks, or the power to sell them, and if he can, makes a bargain. Houghton claimed that the shares of smaller companies were subject to manipulation by the contrivances of a few men in confederacy, who strive to secure all the shares in a stock, what we would call cornering the stock. The dubious contrivances of financiers and the application of advanced speculative techniques, such as hedging with options and futures, reveal a remarkable sophistication in the early stock market. While the stock market merrily bubbled along, the government of William of Orange decided to harness the nation's gambling propensity to raise funds for the war against France. Following Dutch precedent, in 1694 the ubiquitous Thomas Neal launched the first British government lottery. Enticingly styled the Million Adventure, it offered a first prize of £1,000 a year for 16 years for a £10 ticket. Losing tickets, or blanks, received £1 a year for the same period. The 100,000 tickets sold out quickly. A lottery fever ensued, with a multitude of private lottery promotions advertised in the press. Eager to have a finger in every pie, Neal arranged 3 profitable adventure to the fortunate lotteries for his own account. Penny lotteries followed the larger promotions, and stock jobbers subdivided £10 tickets into smaller shares for the less well-off. By the middle of the decade, lottery tickets, like credit notes, were circulating as currency. Projectors in the stock market were not slow to capitalize on the lottery fever. The case of the Company of Mine Adventurers illustrates the curious fusion of lottery gambling and stock market speculation. Established in 1693 to mine for silver in Wales, the company was taken over the following year by an unscrupulous adventurer named Sir Humphrey Mackworth, who soon after announced the conversion of the £20 ordinary shares into interest-paying bonds. The incentive for conversion was that each bond also served as a lottery ticket. 1 in 10 bonds would receive a prize, the top prize being a package of shares and bonds with a prospective income of £2,000 per annum. 700 proprietors were involved in the conversion, and more than 4/5 of the shares were converted in lottery bonds. A slightly different use for lotteries, related by Macaulay, was found by the Royal Academies Company, whose directors advertised that they had engaged the best masters in every branch of knowledge, and were about to issue 20,000 tickets at 20 shillings each. There was to be a lottery. 2,000 prizes were to be drawn, and the fortunate holders of the prizes were to be taught, at the charge of the company, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, Spanish, conic sections, trigonometry, heraldry, japanning, fortification, bookkeeping, and the art of playing the theorbo. A recent historian of the financial revolution has found the late 17th century passion for gambling to be a contradictory trend, running against the financial developments of the age. It is contradictory only if one associates capitalism with the advance of rationalism in the modern world. The view of capitalism as a branch of the Enlightenment was put forward by the sociologist Max Weber, who argued in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism that the development of the spirit of capitalism is best understood as part of the development of rationalism as a whole, and could be deduced from the fundamental position of rationalism on the basic problems of life. For Weber, the advance of the capitalist system was not only a rational movement, it was also puritanical, combining frugality with the Calvinist notion of a professional calling. The system was antithetical to the unlimited greed for gain. Capitalism, he asserted, may be identical with the restraint, or at least a rational tempering, of this irrational impulse. The late 17th century did in fact produce several significant advances in the rationalistic quantification of risk. Alongside his work on the diving bell, Edmund Halley produced in 1693 the first mortality table, based on statistics provided by the Prussian city of Breslau. This allowed Halley to estimate probabilities of death and provide a foundation for the development of actuarial science, upon which the life insurance industry is based. The contemporary passion for gambling also focused people's minds on the issue of probability. In 1693, Samuel Pepys and Isaac Newton engaged in a lengthy correspondence concerning dice-throwing, probabilities, and wagers. John Law, the architect of the Mississippi bubble and the leading speculator of the next generation, earned his keep in the 1690s as a gambler and made a fortune by applying advanced probability theory to the game of hazard, a dice game similar to craps. Law's subsequent transition from gambler to speculator was probably typical of the moneyed men of this era, since Davenant's fictional Tom Double also starts his ignoble career at the card tables of St. James's, before progressing to Exchange Alley. Betting on public and private events was common in the coffee houses of Exchange Alley. According to Defoe, during the 1690s, wagering ceased to be mere gambling and became instead a branch of assurances, a trade found increasingly on the Royal Exchange and in the coffee houses, where it was taken over by stock jobbers. Gambling fostered the growth of insurance. When Edward Lloyd moved his coffee house to Lombard Street in 1691, brokers were underwriting a variety of risks, from highway robbery to the assurance of female chastity. The merchant who took a wager on the outbreak of war, the life expectancy of King William, or the outcome of a siege, was more likely to be doing so because he wished to hedge a business risk than because he was consumed with a gaming lust. The idea of reward offsetting risk was evident in the stock market. When contemporaries considered Phipps's treasure trove, they discussed it in terms of probability. Defoe claimed the success of the expedition had been a lottery of 100,000 to 1 odds, while Aaron Hill stated that the odds against Phipps's backers had been over 1,000,000 to 1 against, but they succeeded even against all prospect of probability, and were enriched by accident. The constant analysis of risk and probability promoted by gambling and speculation may be seen as an extension of rationalism, although it has nothing to do with Weber's view of capitalism as an embodiment of Calvinist sobriety. Despite its contribution to advances in probability theory, gambling retained its particular irrational qualities. As Sir Richard Steele observed in the choice of a lottery number, caprice very often acts in place of reason, and forms to itself some groundless imaginary motive, where real and substantial ones are wanting. Later, Adam Smith used the example of purchasers of lottery tickets to illustrate the contempt of risk and presumptuous hope of success that he considered a universal tendency in mankind. This observation might have been equally well applied to speculators investing in the patent companies of the 1690s. A gambling psychology infused every aspect of the new financial world, with the stock jobbers dealing in shares, lottery tickets, and wagers at the centre of this gambling maelstrom. The stock market did not emerge to finance the sober Calvinist capitalist, nor did it appeal to puritanical notions of thrift. Rather, it took its cue from the fantastic lottery-like success of Phipps's adventure. In this context, the combination of stock market speculation and lottery gambling in a company such as the mine adventurers was an entirely natural development. There was no contradiction between gambling and financial innovation, because gaming was the essence of the stock market, or, as Defoe put it, stock jobbing is play. A box and dice may be less dangerous, the nature of them are alike, a hazard. Rather than being antithetical to capitalism, as Weber suggested, greed and the irrational gambling impulse actually helped to advance its institutions. Keynes's claim that the game of investment is intolerably boring and over-exacting to anyone who is entirely exempt from the gambling instinct, whilst he who has it must pay to this propensity the appropriate toll, is as valid for the 17th century as for the 20th. The successful establishment of the stock market and the joint stock company over other forms of capital organization lay in their incorporating within themselves elements of the gaming room. In the origins of financial capitalism, rationalism was very much a subsidiary element. Head-dresses and hemlines. 17th-century investors were no less sophisticated than their counterparts in the modern world. The valuation of annuities and lottery tickets, both of which paid an income for a limited number of years but did not return the principal, involved the process of discounting future cash flows. What is nowadays called the time value of money is clearly comprehended in John Law's remark that anticipation is always at a discount. £100 to be paid now is of more value than £1,000 to be paid by £10 a year for 100 years. The concept of fundamental or intrinsic value was also understood by players in the early stock market, although misleading prospectuses, the manipulation of share prices, and the stock market boom made its discovery an even more difficult task than usual. After the 1690s boom, Defoe stated that many stocks had been raised above their intrinsic value, and that shares in the East India Company had sold at between 300 and 400% above their nominal value, without any material difference in intrinsic value. The contemporary land bank projectors, who wanted to replace a gold-backed currency with one supported by the value of land, even realized that the notion of intrinsic value was an oxymoron, since intrinsic suggested an inward quality, while value was always external. For instance, Nicholas Barbon argued that things have no value in themselves, it is opinion and fashion which brings them into use and gives them a value. John Law, who was also a land bank projector, went even further and claimed that price was simply the result of the interaction of supply and demand. Applied to the stock market, Law's idea suggests that share prices are determined by liquidity, the supply of new funds to the market, rather than a reflection of inherent values. The land banker's argument that value was an extrinsic quality, subject to changing opinion and fashion, was particularly relevant to the stock market, since from the launch of diving companies onwards, the market had fallen for a succession of fads. The rise of the stock market in the early 1690s was accompanied by a fashion for increasingly extravagant ladies' headdresses, which climbed in height from the early 1690s until they peaked at over 7 feet in 1695, the year the stock market crashed. This prompted Sir Richard Steele to remark that stocks have risen and fallen in proportion to headdresses, an observation which anticipates the connection made between women's rising hemlines and the stock market in the 1920s, what has become known as the hemline theory of stock prices. There are several possible interpretations of Steele's comment. A daring and extravagant fashion might indicate that stock market profits were being spent on gaudy display, a sign of the conspicuous consumption which accompanies every speculative episode. On the other hand, one might see in the rising headdress of the moneyed man's mistress, or later in the rising hemline of the 1920s flapper, an indication of the moral laxity of speculative periods, when the spirit of self-interest is dominant and more sober virtues are despised. It appears more likely, however, that Steele was suggesting that market values, evanescent, ephemeral, and extravagant, were as much a reflection of passing fashion as female modes of attire. A fashionable style, like a speculative movement, is subject to a popular consensus and follows a trend, until it reaches a point of extravagance from which it can only retreat. A few years later, Steele articulated what is perhaps the earliest contrarian theory of investment, that is, one that goes against the prevailing view. Is it possible that a young man at present could pass his time better than in reading the history of stocks, and knowing by what secret springs they have such sudden ascents and falls in the same day? Could he be better conducted on his way to wealth, which is the great article of life, than in a treatise dated from Change Alley by an able proficient there? Nothing could be more useful than to be well instructed in his hope and fears, to be diffident when others exalt, and with a secret joy buy when others think it their interest to sell. Keynes argued that since the future could not be known with any degree of certainty, values in the stock market ultimately depended on a state of confidence, itself the outcome of the mass psychology of a large number of ignorant individuals. Observing the undulations of the market and the constant flux of credit more than 2 centuries earlier, Steele anticipated what has been called the castles in the air theory of value. In the pages of The Spectator, he describes entering the Palace of Vanity, whose dome bore so far the resemblance of a bubble, where vanity sat attended by ostentation, self-conceit, flattery, affectation, and fashion. When broken credit appears alongside folly, an allegory for speculative irrationality, there is consternation, and the visitor plainly discerned the building to hang a little up in the air without any real foundation. But as they begun to sink lower in their own minds, methought the palace sunk along with us, till they arrived at the due point of esteem which they ought to have for themselves. Then part of the building in which they stood touched the earth. In the new economic system brought into existence by the financial revolution, there was no longer a substantial economic reality. Values were the product of a skittish and trivial mass psychology, trade was dependent on a transient state of confidence, and companies floated on waves of speculative euphoria. Scandals and corruption. In the stock market of the 1690s, the line between commendable self-interest and arrant fraud was frequently crossed. Sham companies were launched for the enrichment of projectors, share prices were manipulated, and false rumours were circulated. In The Volunteers, Thomas Shadwell described the stock market as a world of sharpers and cheats, where men bubbled each other for profit. At this date, to bubble meant to perpetrate a fraud. Charles Davenant describes the moneyed men as practising a variety of cheats, extortions, frauds, bribery, and corruption in their pursuit of wealth. The term stock jobbing, synonymous with speculation as well as the trade in shares, also described the act of blowing up shares above their true value while simultaneously running down a company's real prospects. In a world where credit notes and lottery tickets circulated as money, company shares became the currency of corruption. Gifts of stock were secretly made to figures of note, either to attract other investors or to silence their objections. As Shadwell's Colonel Hackwell boasts, "I have shares in some companies that cost me nothing, but were given to me to prevent my caveats." Shares were also used to purchase political influence. In the great bribery scandal of the East India Company, age-old political venality came into contact with the new forces of financial speculation. The scandal had its origin in the failure of the East India Company in March 1693 to pay a special tax on the value of its stock. As a result, the company's charters were technically forfeited at a time when a rival syndicate was attempting to snatch the Eastern trade monopoly from the old company. Both groups engaged in extensive bribery, both at court and in Parliament, with a view to securing a new charter. The contest ended in victory for the established company after the expenditure of over £200,000 of Secret Service money. The application of options and shares in the bribery was relatively sophisticated. In one example, Sir Basil Firebrass, a Member of Parliament, contracted with the company an option to put, that is, sell, £60,000 of East India stock to the company at a premium of 50% to the prevailing market price once the company had been granted a new charter. This deal brought him an eventual profit of £30,000. Many other parliamentarians received call options in the company, giving them the right to buy the stock at a fixed price. This allowed them to benefit from any gain in share price resulting from their ensuring the company's future. In 1695, the report of the parliamentary investigation into the scandal led to the expulsion of the Speaker of the Commons, the impeachment of the Lord President of the Council, and the imprisonment of the Governor of the East India Company. The scandal appeared to lend substance to John Pollexfen's celebrated contemporary remark that companies have bodies, but it is said they have no souls. If no souls, no consciences. It revealed how contagious the mores of the moneyed men had become, and showed how the stock market could become a dangerous snare for politicians whose self-interest was no less intense than that of the stock jobbers. All this foreshadowed the systematic corruption of politicians during later periods of speculation. As Defoe warned on the eve of the South Sea bubble, some 2 decades later, when statesmen turn jobbers, the state may be jobbed. The old lady takes her first step. On the 21st of June, 1694, the subscription lists opened for a venture incorporated as the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. This new establishment epitomized the financial marvels of the age. The bank was granted a royal charter and banking monopoly on condition that it lent £1,200,000 to the government. However, it was allowed to provide this loan in the form of its own banknotes of no intrinsic value, that is, they were not backed by gold, on which it nevertheless received an annual interest payment from the government of £100,000. Paper currency, the philosopher's stone of financial capitalism, had received the first tentative mark of government approval. The Bank of England's flotation was a great success. Its subscription books were filled in a few days, with investors ranging from the Earl of Portland, King William's favourite, to a medley of apothecaries, carriers, clothworkers, embroiderers, farmers, mariners, and wharfingers. Bank of England shares jumped to a 20% premium. The stock market boom entered its final phase. A variety of land bank projects were brought forward, but none got off the ground. It was even suggested that the income from the City of London's Orphans Fund should be pledged to provide the capital for an orphans' bank. An anonymous pamphleteer protested that, even at the bottom of this charitable and pious project, self-interest and private profit lies securely entrenched. The last great flotation of the period originated far from Exchange Alley, in Edinburgh. The Scotsman William Paterson, one of the founders of the Bank of England, established the Darien Company with the intention of settling the Isthmus of Panama, which he envisaged as a potential world entrepot. The Darien Company's backers saw an opportunity to lay the foundations of a Scottish empire in competition with their Sassenach neighbour. Fuelled with nationalist sentiments, the Scots public showed great enthusiasm for the £300,000 subscription, which opened in late June 1695. According to the Secretary of State in Scotland, Sir John Dalrymple, the frenzy of the Scots nation to sign the solemn league and covenant never exceeded the rapidity with which they ran to subscribe to the Darien Company. Young women threw their little fortunes into the stock. Widows sold their jointures to command money for the same purpose. The launch of the Darien Company exhibited certain novel features. As only half the capital was allocated to be raised in Scotland, Paterson attempted to sell the remaining shares first in London, then in Amsterdam, and finally in Hamburg, where £200,000 of stock was offered for sale in what was the first international flotation. A more dubious feature of the public offering was the decision by the Darien Company's directors to issue banknotes as loans to shareholders against the security of their stock. Paterson's example inspired his fellow Scot, John Law, who a couple of decades later issued millions of banknotes against the deposit of Mississippi Company shares. While the Darien Company was being launched in a flurry of Scottish excitement, soon to be cruelly disappointed by the failure of the company, a financial crisis loomed south of the border. As with many later crises, its cause lay in a combination of monetary distress with speculative revulsion. Despite the many innovations of Dutch finance, the costs of the war with France had exceeded public revenue, and the government had turned to the age-old remedy of debasing the coinage. In accordance with Gresham's law, named after Elizabeth I's finance minister, who observed that bad money drives out good money, people began hoarding the undebased coins. In the summer of 1696, John Evelyn recorded in his diary a want of current money to carry on not only the smallest concerns, but for daily provisions in the common markets. Riots broke out in the north of England. Credit, that nervous creature, took flight from the city. Government tallies, short-term public debt, fell to a 40% discount, and a lottery loan for £1,400,000 raised less than £18,000. Shares were badly affected. The bellwether East India Company share price fell from 200 in 1692 to 37 in 1697. In the same period, shares in the Hudson's Bay Company and the Linen Company fell by 70% and 90% respectively. Most of the new companies, including all the diving and patent companies, simply disappeared. Of 140 English and Scottish companies operating in 1693, only 40 survived the crisis to 1697, a failure rate of 70%. Daniel Defoe, the projector's cully, attributed the crisis to the activities of the stock jobbers in Exchange Alley. Anyone might have foreseen that the strife and contention of our two rival East India companies would produce some more than ordinary effect, and that the raising of stock of all sorts to a value so much above the intrinsic must have some fatal issue, and would fall somewhere at last so heavy as to be felt by the whole body of trade. This was the first time an economic crisis had been linked to speculation. The anonymous author of a pamphlet published in 1696 and entitled Angliae Tutamen, The Defence of England, hoped that a fair and clear discovery of many crafty cheats and villainous knaveries will be of vast advantage to the public. He held opportunistic projectors to be responsible for the collapse of many worthy undertakings. This opinion was shared by the official trade commissioners, whose report on the crisis was published in late 1696. The commissioners also attacked brokers who had confederated themselves together for the purpose of manipulating prices. In 1697, Parliament passed a law to refrain the number and ill practices of brokers and stock jobbers, restricting the total number of stock jobbers to 100, licensed by the aldermen of the City of London. When the regulation was renewed in 1708, brokers were required to pay an annual subscription for registration, and the number of Jewish brokers was held to a maximum of 12. Stock jobbers were also forbidden from dealing on their own account, or charging a commission greater than 1/8 of 1%. As with the earlier Dutch attempts to regulate speculation, these provisions had little effect, and most brokers continued their trade without official sanction. The speculative paradigm. Charles Kindleberger, in his book Manias, Panics and Crashes, suggests that speculative manias typically commence with a displacement which excites speculative interest. The displacement may come either from an entirely new object of investment or from the increased profitability of established investments. It is followed by positive feedback as rising share prices induce inexperienced investors to enter the stock market, and results in euphoria, a sign that investors' rationality is weakened. During the course of the mania, speculation becomes more diffuse and spreads to different classes of assets. New companies are floated to take advantage of the euphoria. Investors leverage their gains using either financial derivatives or stock loans. Credit becomes overextended, swindling and fraud proliferate, and the economy enters a period of financial distress, which is the prelude